This time, the journey didn't just start early. It started ridiculously early. To make it to the meeting on time, I had to leave before dawn and navigate through morning fog that looked absolutely fantastical and mysterious. Even the eternal German roadworks felt almost bearable. This trip turned out to be one of the most unusual for me. I had absolutely no idea what to expect. An amazing mix of rich history and near-total destruction, a long history of uprisings and a socialist past, language that sounds familiar yet is completely independent. History I'd already touched upon in Reggio Emilia, one of my favorite book series from childhood, and another from my youth. To say my head was all over the place would be putting it mildly. But all this only fueled my interest and made this trip even more intriguing. As usual, you'll find a complete map in the video description with the route and all the points, so you can plan your own walk. Like some others, I had to split this one into two parts. Tackling the entire program in one go proved impossible. Let's go! As always, I'll start with a brief historical overview. Though in Warsaw's case, I must admit, not a very deep one. Compared to most European capitals, Warsaw is in the prime of its career. It's not as ancient as Rome, which we also explored in two parts, or say London, also stretched across two episodes, but it is not as young as Reykjavik, Valletta or Helsinki. Some settlements on the banks of the Vistula have been known since the 10th century. But back then it wasn't a city, of course, just small settlements, partly fishing, partly providing a river crossing. Warsaw itself, or something that sounded rather like it, is mentioned in manuscripts from the early 14th century, and people are still arguing the toss about the exact origin of the name. The most beautiful, though not the most plausible version, is about a local fisherman named Wars, marrying a mermaid called Sava. The result of this love wasn't exactly what you're thinking, but rather Warsaw's modern coat of arms and several monuments in the city, which we will see later. Surprisingly, Warsaw wasn't always the capital. Until 1596, the main city was Krakow, and only King Sigismund III moved his residence to Warsaw. Though for nearly 140 more years, elected Polish kings were still crowned in Krakow, with one exception I'll tell you about during our walk. And officially, Warsaw only became the capital in 1791. In the early 19th century, Warsaw briefly served as the capital of the Duchy of Warsaw, essentially under French administration. And then, for 100 years, as the capital of the Kingdom of Poland, now under the Russian Empire. Then, Warsaw was the capital of the Polish Republic, then under German occupation, during which the city was almost completely destroyed. We'll talk more about this. And then, again as a capital, but now of the Socialist Polish People's Republic. And then, after the collapse of the Socialist bloc, once again simply the Republic of Poland. But enough history. Let's finally go and see what remains after all these historical upheavals. The first stop is a legacy of the Russian Empire. After the uprising of 1830-31, Nicholas I decided to strengthen the Russian presence in Warsaw. And architect Ivan then built what's called the Alexander Citadel, modeled after the fortress in Antwerp. Interestingly, the Poles themselves paid for the fortress construction in Warsaw. 11 million rubles, that's roughly 8.5 tons of gold at the time, yes, tons, were taken from the city treasury and the Bank of Poland as a punishment for the uprising. There's nothing new in this approach, mind you. The Florentines did exactly the same thing, building a fortress in Siena at the Sienese expense, which I talked about in that episode. One way or another, the fortress was completed in 1834, but 20 years later, 5 more forts were added, one of which I'll show you in a moment. Besides soldiers, the fortress naturally became a convenient place for a prison. Over time, it housed Felix Dzerzhinsky from the Polish nobility, who will later create what will become a KGB in the Soviet Union, Marxist theorist Rosa Luxemburg, and future Marshal of Poland Józef Pilsudski, and of course many others. The fortress continued to be used by the military long after modern artillery made such structures pointless. In 1944, the German garrison in the fortress significantly hindered the development of the uprising. And even after the war, the fortress was used by the Polish army for a long time, mainly as archives and auxiliary facilities, though part of the air defense was also stationed there. Since 1963, the fortress has housed a museum. As I mentioned, by 1854, 5 more bastions were added to the fortress. Back then, they were called Vladimir, Alexei, Pavel, George, and Sergei. They will later be renamed. Some will not survive to this day, but one of those remaining, and incidentally in the best condition, is the fort of Dąbrowski's legions, the very ones whose march became the national anthem of Poland. Nearby, there's another well-preserved fort, the so-called Fort Traugutt, originally Fort Alexei, renamed in honor of Romuald Traugutt, one of the leaders of yet another Polish uprising in 1863–64. If you're interested in such artifacts, feel free to have a look. Not far from the citadel, on Freta Street, stands a rather unremarkable house. It is only decorated by an enormous plaque, but that still doesn't match the scale of what it represents. The original building was destroyed by the Nazis during the 1944 uprising, but has been excellently restored. This is the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Museum. The first woman to receive a Nobel Prize. The second, by the way, was her daughter, Irene. And the first person in history to win the Nobel Prize twice. The first female university professor. The co-discoverer of radioactivity, along with her husband Pierre and Henri Becquerel. And the first to obtain 2 radioactive elements, radium and polonium, which she named after her homeland. What a remarkable woman with an iron will and sense of dignity. The story of the beginning of her education alone is worth a novel. Have a look if you didn't know. Later, despite the Nobel Prize, a woman who dared to try to become an academician was blackballed in elections to the French Academy of Sciences, and she refused to participate in elections for a second time. She received offers of the Legion of Honor twice and refused it. Twice. So, quite a museum. Entry costs just 15 zloty. That's about 3.5 euros. Seems quite affordable to me. From here, you can cut through and go straight to the center, to the fortress walls and the old town market, but if you want more beauty, then head right. Past the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Marker, we'll talk about it later, to the Krasiński Palace. Originally, the palace was built in the second half of the 17th century for Voivod Jan Krasiński. Honestly, I'm not very familiar with his life, but the Baroque palace in French style is truly magnificent. Inside the palace, there were originally frescoes by Michelangelo Palloni, court painter to King John III Sobieski. The pediment was decorated with the triumph of Marcus Valerius Corvinus by Andreas Schulte, but unfortunately little of the original survived. Though, like much in Warsaw, the palace has been excellently restored. For some time, the building housed Poland's Supreme Court. But now it has moved to a building on the other side of this same square, and the palace, restored after the war, became a branch of the National Library and open to the public. There's now an exhibition of manuscripts, and a small part of the Zalucki Library is located there, which I'll tell you about shortly. On the opposite side of the square is a memorial to the participants of the Warsaw Uprising. You can walk up to it and have a look. It consists of two parts. In one, the resistance soldiers are fighting from beneath symbolically depicted collapsing buildings. And on the other, a group is descending underground, since underground communications were then the main transport corridor and shelter. But let us talk about the uprising itself a bit later, in the second part of this walk. If you're so inclined, you can venture slightly off to the side. It is a separate route on the map. There you'll find a large and rather fascinating museum of the history of Polish Jews, in front of which stands the monument to the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the very one which Willy Brandt found the strength to kneel in apology. And a bit further on, the remains of Pawiak Prison. Initially an ordinary prison, but during the war it became notorious for the executions of Polish and Jewish captives. This is one of few places the Poles decide not to rebuild, and I think quite rightly so. But I'm now heading around the palace we have just seen. Through the park behind Krasiński Palace, which has been open to the public since 1768, you can reach a building that has changed roles 5 or 6 times in its history and was the center of several historical events. Originally built in the mid-16th century on the orders of Stefan Batory as a shelter for war veterans, 100 years later it was converted into a city arsenal. This made it the center of many subsequent events, and the thick walls allowed it to store not just weapons. During the Warsaw Uprising of 1794, fierce battles took place here between the insurgents and the Russian garrison stationed in Warsaw. And 31 years after another Polish uprising, the former arsenal was converted into a prison. Of course, one could make up a nice legend about political prisoners and all that, but since the citadel where we started our walk was built at about the same time, political prisoners were actually kept there, mainly in Pavilion 10, whilst the former arsenal was mostly a place for common criminals. Later, the building was converted into a police station, then into city archives, and once again given its 17th century appearance. During the Second World War, it became a prison and police station again. And it was here, in March 1943, that one of the most famous operations of the Polish underground took place, aptly named Operation Arsenal, when Poles attacked a prison convoy transporting prisoners and freed one of their leaders from the Gestapo, along with 21 other people. During the Warsaw Uprising, the arsenal was one of the rebel strongholds, and after its suppression, like many other buildings, it suffered greatly, but was restored, and since 1959 it has housed the Museum of Archaeology. Here we have arrived at a building whose main decoration now consists of bustos of Polish kings, which is why it's sometimes called the house under the kings, though its main value is something else. This is Poland's first public library. Originally, the palace was built for Mikołaj Danilovich in 1621, but was destroyed during the so-called Swedish Deluge, or Polish-Swedish War of 1655 to 1660. In this state, it was bought by two Zalucki brothers, Józef Andrzej and Andrzej Stanisław. In 1747, the brothers rebuilt it, with Francesco Antonio Milana's help, in the Rococo style, and moved here their magnificent library, which initially numbered about 200,000 items, and by 1780 already 400,000 items, including not only books and manuscripts, but also works of art, scientific instruments, and specimens of flora and fauna. At that moment, it was one of the 4 largest libraries in Europe, alongside the British Museum Library in London and the Royal Libraries in Paris and Munich. Moreover, the library was open to public. All that was required of visitors was silence and prayer on behalf of the Zaluckis. What's more, books were initially even allowed to be taken home. Well, true, they soon had to abandon this, because the theft became such a serious problem that the bishops who patronized the library had to turn to Pope Benedict XIV for help, who issued a special papal bull threatening excommunication for stealing books. Honestly, that didn't particularly help. The library's subsequent fate is rather sad. After the 1794 uprising, Catherine II, as punishment, removed the library to St. Petersburg, where a year later it formed the basis of the Imperial Public Library. 3 times, in 1842 and 1863, and then in the 1920s, parts of the library returned to Poland and formed the basis for the Polish National Library in 1928. The Poles themselves, rather boldly, counted its founding as 1747, just with a 134-year break. Unfortunately, the library's adventures did not end there. During the Second World War, the library was stored in the Krasiński Palace, which we've already seen. And after the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising, it was deliberately destroyed by the Nazis, along with the both buildings where it was housed. This is what the house under the kings looked like in 1945. Only 1,800 manuscripts and about 30,000 books survived. One should really think about a monument to the vanished books, as they did in Berlin. In fact, something similar already exists in the Krasiński Palace. This is an urn containing books burned by the Nazis. We are finally approaching the center. And here, of course, the palaces become much grander. Here, for example, is Branicki Palace. A palace from the 1740s built for young Clemens Branicki, Grand Crown Hetman, essentially the commander-in-chief to the Polish army. After Branicki's death, the palace was inherited by his wife, Izabela Branicka, née Poniatowska, a learned woman, patron, benefactor of education, and sister to none other than the last king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Stanisław August Poniatowski. Later, the owners changed several more times, until in 1945 the palace was nationalized. Restored like many Warsaw buildings, various state structures were housed in it, until in 2008 the palace was returned to the previous owners, the Potocki family, who restored the palace once more and began renting it out. A very touching monument just walk along the outer side of the wall, another reminder of the 1944 Warsaw Uprising. This is a monument to the children who participated in it. I generally much prefer such small, non-monumental memorials. They don't overwhelm you or make you feel like a speck of dust compared to someone great. And here too, it's very human somehow. Of course, adults did the main fighting, but don't think children are fantasy. Here, for example, is one of the possible prototypes. Further along the outer side of the fortress wall, looking rather fresh and obviously restored, but very successfully fitting into the overall feel of Warsaw, you can reach a rather strange structure. An enormous semicircular tower with gates and towers. This is the so-called Warsaw Barbican, the only surviving medieval city gate. Barbican is actually a round or semicircular outer defensive structure of medieval fortresses. This particular Barbican wasn't very lucky in life. It appeared in 1540, just at the moment when, due to the development of artillery, all these structures lost their military purpose. So this Barbican was only used as intended once, in the Polish-Swedish War I mentioned in the story about the Zalucki Library. Later, the narrow gates got seriously in the way of trade, and the Barbican was gradually dismantled. In the 19th century, in a partially demolished state, it became part of residential buildings, and in 1944, like everything around it, was almost completely destroyed and only restored in the 1950s. The center of Old Warsaw is, of course, the historic market square. Like in all old cities, it serves as both a common gathering place and a market, and a place for entertainment, executions, and any remotely serious city event. Depends on what you're lucky enough to catch. The city council, the town hall, was naturally here too, from roughly the early 15th century. It was rebuilt many times, but this is how it looked until 1817, when it was finally dismantled. In 1850, the new town hall looked like this. The surrounding buildings naturally also suffered regularly. They were badly damaged in the Great Fire of 1607. Then they began restoring them first in the fashionable Renaissance style of the time, and when fashion passed in the 18th century, in Baroque. Unfortunately, please don't think that what you see now is even the 1701 reconstruction. The city center suffered very badly. Actually, let's say it was destroyed by the Germans after the Warsaw Uprising. This is what the square looked like in 1944. The battles for the city in 1945 also added to the destruction. So after the war, a complete reconstruction was undertaken, finished in 1955. Based on the pre-war images, the square was restored. Though I should mention that the restored appearance only concerns the facades. The layout of the flats behind them doesn't correspond to the historical version. But do we care as tourists? The square is really beautiful and very carefully restored. Now on the square there are a couple of museums and plenty of cafes, somehow positioned so successfully that they don't really get into the way of walking around the square itself. Also, on the same square stands one of the mermaids, symbols of Warsaw. In my opinion, this is the most successful depiction of her. Well, not that I've met her personally, mind you, but I'll show you another one on the embankment a little bit later, and you can compare for yourselves. This particular mermaid was moved from the square in 1929, but thanks to the citizens of Warsaw, it was returned in 1999. And special thanks to the residents for not succumbing to the terrible tradition, where statues are assigned a special place for rubbing for luck, causing poor monuments to gleam with some polished side or intimate body part. Among other legends, one associated with the Warsaw Mermaid claims that she is the sister of the mermaid in Copenhagen. The two of them swam together in the Black Sea. One swam up the Vistula and the other into the Danish Straits, where her sculpture still stands to this day. The first sister was less lucky. Swimming past Warsaw, she was caught by a greedy merchant to sing for money at fairs. And only the bravery and maybe love of a local fisherman who took pity on the girl and freed her helped the mermaid escape. And in gratitude for her rescue, she promised to help and protect the inhabitants of Warsaw. on the neighboring street with the inspiring name Pivnia. There really were some breweries here once. You can pop into the museum pharmacy. A pharmacy has been here since the 15th century. Just imagine that. The first in Warsaw. Not necessarily in this exact house, but after 600 years it's really not so important, I think. The museum is named after Antonina Lesniewska, one of the first women with a pharmacist degree in the Russian Empire. In 1901, after many difficulties, she opened the first women's pharmacy in St. Petersburg on Nevsky Prospect next to St. Catherine Church, which I'll mention again later. And 2 years later, a 2-year women's pharmaceutical school, which during the First World War became an institute and trained female pharmacists in 4 years. As it was customary after the revolution in 1918, the pharmacy was nationalized. Lesniewska was forced to emigrate. At least she stayed alive. She went to her native Poland and developed the pharmacy business in Warsaw. Originally, the museum pharmacy was located on Marszałkowska Street, where Lesniewska had her Warsaw pharmacy, but later moved to this house, where in the late 17th to early 18th century lived Tilman van Gameren, an architect, Dutch by birth, but who spent practically his entire life in Poland, becoming the main representative of Baroque in the Commonwealth. For example, the Krasiński Palace, which we saw earlier, was built to his design. This rather odd building, restored in some kind of Dutch style to its 14th century look, since there was effectively nothing left of its pre-war Gothic appearance, is actually quite spacious inside. This is Warsaw's main Catholic cathedral, the Church of St. John the Baptist. Befitting its status, elected rulers of Poland were crowned here. I should say that out of all the countries I know, only Poland actually elected kings. Yes, from the nobility, but changing dynasties was routine. Vasa, Wiśniewiecki, Leszczyński, Poniatowski. Of course, kings were also elected in Bohemia, in the Holy Roman Empire and in Hungary, but only in Poland could the throne legally not be passed by inheritance. And after Sigismund II Augustus, from 1572, royal power was completely elective. A sort of spirited democratic monarchy, you know? Didn't fancy the previous king? Right then, thanks very much, off you pop, we'll find another one. This level of independence from the previous ruler exists perhaps only in the Vatican. There, for obvious reasons, hereditary papacy is excluded in principle. But let's return to Warsaw. The church, as usual, suffered greatly during the Second World War, and like the entire center of Warsaw, was restored, and now serves as a kind of pantheon. For example, Henryk Sienkiewicz and the last king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are buried here. I promised to tell you about one exception in coronations. Here it is. Generally, coronations took place not in Warsaw but in Wawel Cathedral in Krakow. Despite all the fluctuations of Polish political life, this historic place emphasized the continuity of rulers. But in 1705, Poland was not only in a state of war. That very great northern war, the Battle of Poltava, the capture of Narva, but also within Poland itself, there was a struggle between supporters of the then King Augustus II and supporters of his removal, who were actively supported by Swedish King Charles XII, who was fighting on several fronts at once. One way or another, Krakow was occupied by supporters of Augustus II. So the Swedish protégé and incidentally the last Duke of Lorraine, I'll tell you about this in the episode about Nancy, Stanislav I Leszczyński, was crowned in Swedish-controlled Warsaw, specifically in the Church of St. John the Baptist. Then there were complicated twists, with Augustus' return and Stanislav I's rule again until in 1734, Augustus III ascended to the throne, who by all tradition was once again crowned in Krakow. True, the last Polish king, Stanislav II Poniatowski, was again crowned in Warsaw, and also, of course, in this same church. which more or less ended the Polish royal tradition. And the fate of the king himself was in some sense consonant with the fate of the state that had lost its status and power of Europe's largest state. After the suppression of Kosciuszko's uprising, Stanislav in 1795 was taken to Grodno, where he abdicated the Polish throne in favor of Catherine II, thus completing the third partition of Poland. 3 years later, he suddenly died in St. Petersburg. Stanislav's remains were first buried in the Church of St. Catherine, next to which Antonina Lesniewska would open her pharmacy 100 years later. Then, in 1938, the king's remnants were transferred to Poland and reburied in the Holy Trinity Church in the village of Wolsing, where he was born. But according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the territory became part of the Belarusian Soviet Republic. The church was used as a warehouse, the royal grave was looted, and only in 1990 what could be preserved and found from the burial of the last king of the Commonwealth was brought to Warsaw, to the Church of St. John the Baptist. Since we've delved into the story of Polish kings, this palace we've come to is appropriate. Originally, it was a fortification protecting the river crossing. Then, as the city grew, the residence of the Mazovian princes. They began fortifying the castle, and it seems one of the reconstructions was Warsaw's first brick building. At the very beginning of the 15th century, Janusz of Mazovia expanded the brick castle building, traces of which are visible to this day. I won't go into listing everyone who visited and lived here. I'll just say that during the Polish-Lithuanian state, apart from the country's rulers, the Parliament of the United States regularly met here. Then, at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries, Sigismund Vasa demolished this entire structure and built his castle here. The decoration and dominant feature of the castle became Sigismund's 60-meter tower. New Palace hosted, for example, the deposed and forcibly tonsured Tsar Vasily Shuisky, whom Hetman Żalkiewski removed from the Joseph Volokolamsk monastery. Once brought to Warsaw, Shuisky and his brothers were presented to Sigismund and swore allegiance to him. By this time, the castle was already filling with works of art. Sigismund III and his successors, Vladislav IV and John II Casimir, brought their canvases by Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto, Guido Reni, Rubens, Bruegel the Elder, sculptures by Giambologna, well, practically a Florence branch office. As a symbol of Poland, the castle naturally suffered in every war, including the Swedish Deluge and the Great Northern War I've already mentioned. Even the copper roof was ripped off and carted home. Not to mention the art collections and libraries. Exhibits were plundered and shipped off, quite the cultural exchange British Museum style. Each time after this, the castle was restored and rebuilt. Jan Sobieski restored it according to his ideas. Augustus III rebuilt it his way. But the biggest rebuilding happened under the already mentioned Stanislav II Poniatowski, who added a library, a new wing along the Vistula, and of course redid the interiors in the contemporary style and rebuilt the Senate chamber. Stanislav II didn't limit himself to architectural changes. Under him, the castle hosted the so-called Thursday dinners, to which scientists, writers, artists and musicians were invited. Here, in the palace, in 1829, the only coronation of Russian Emperor Nicholas I as Tsar of Poland took place. After the suppression of another Polish uprising 2 years later, the Polish constitution, which stipulated the requirement for coronation of Polish monarchs specifically in Warsaw, was abolished, and Alexander II and all subsequent emperors, though they bore the title of Tsar of Poland, were not crowned in Warsaw anymore. Until the start of the Second World War, the castle stood intact. But in 1929, during the annexation and partition of Poland, in accordance with that very secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, German artillery shelled and severely damaged it. Subsequently, during German occupation, the castle was deliberately left without the roof, to further worsen its condition. And then, in 1944, like the entire center of Warsaw, everything that still remained was blown up. This is all that remained of the beautiful castle by 1945. 20 years later, in 1965, the castle remains and cellars were recognized as a historical monument, but work didn't begin until 1971 and took 13 years. Only by 1984 was the restored palace finished, in the form in which it existed at the beginning of the 17th century. Nowadays, there's a museum with paintings by Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Raphael and many others, as well as the collection of more practical items, the ceremonial sword of the Order of St. Stanislav and presidential regalia. On the square in front of the castle stands a column with a statue of that same Sigismund Vasa. Interestingly, on this same square there are two other pillars on which the statue once stood. They're damaged and can't be set upright, so many people don't even notice them. But it's worth approaching the southern facade of the castle, and there they are. You can actually walk up and touch history with your own hands. Quite unusual, but a lovely surprise. We've seen castles and palaces, paintings by old masters and royal collections. Now let's turn to another art form: theatre. Warsaw's theatrical center is the square with the same name. And the first thing you see on it is an enormous building whose purpose is impossible to mistake. Just look at the quadriga above the entrance. This is the Grand Theatre, National Opera. The Polish National Ballet is also located here. The building itself stands on the site of the Merivale trading rows, which were at one time even converted into a monastery, and later bought by the Zalucki brothers, I've already mentioned. The new theatre building was created to a design by Antonio Corazzi, and according to some sources Christian Piotr Einer, in 1833, and opened the same year with Joaquin Rossini's opera The Barber of Seville. The quadriga above the entrance, by the way, wasn't there then. It really was intended in the original design, but yet another Polish uprising disrupted all construction plans, and the place remained empty for nearly 180 more years. Only in 2002 was the quadriga finally installed there according to a modern design. Like many other buildings, the theatre didn't survive the war. True, it got hit earlier than others. During Germany's capture of Poland in 1939, German bombing destroyed the theatre. And in 1944, in the ruins, Germans executed uprising participants, about which there's a commemorative plaque on the building. The theatre's restoration took quite a long time. It was reopened only in 1965, and interestingly, the restoration was led by none other than Arnold Schiffman, whom I'll mention again in connection with the Polish theatre in Warsaw shortly. In 2011, as part of celebrating the 100th anniversary of Digilev's ballet Rus, a bronze sculpture of Václav and Bronislawa Nijinsky as the faun and nymph from one of their most famous ballets was installed in the theatre foyer. After opera and ballet, on to dramatic art. In the very same building as the Grand Theatre is the National Theatre. Although it shares the building with the opera, they have completely different histories. The National Theatre is noticeably older. It was founded by Stanislav August Poniatowski in 1765 and was initially located on Krasiński Square. Besides artistic productions, the theatre became a musical center. It was here that Frédéric Chopin first played his Piano Concerto No. 1 in 1830. Later, the theatre existed in various forms, and with a break after the war for building restoration. Until in 1985, a fire destroyed the stage, and the theatre temporarily moved to the Theatre on Volia building, then took a break and from 1997 returned to the wing of the Grand Theatre next to the National Opera. And finally, to finish with the Grand Theatre building complex, here is also the Warsaw Theatre Museum. Opened in 1957, it's accessible to all visitors to performances, operas and ballets, and contains more than 200,000 exhibits telling about all aspects of theatrical life in Poland, from painting and sculpture to photographs, scenography and programs. Museums aside, Warsaw is definitely worth just strolling around. If you are interested in parks, one of them is the so-called Saxon Garden. Historically, Sigismund III Vasa's fortress walls stood here, along with the palace of Jan Andrzej Morsyn, built in 1666. King Augustus the Strong expanded the park and included it into the so-called Saxon axis, a set of buildings and parks running perpendicular to the Vistula, westward or southwestward, starting from what is now the presidential palace. For various reasons, this project was never fully realized. For example, there were plans to demolish the Lubomirski Palace, but overall, the Saxon axis is still traceable. Moreover, its final formation was only completed in 1970, when the Lubomirski Palace, the very one that was supposed to be demolished, was rotated 74 degrees so that it would complete the ensemble. The palace itself, like many Warsaw buildings, was rebuilt several times. First in Baroque, then in some kind of neoclassicism, then was destroyed during the Second World War, and then restored and rotated as part of the final composition. Since we've come here, near the palace there's a recent monument to Tadeusz Kosciuszko from 2010. It's an exact copy of the monument from 1910 in Washington. Behind the palace, if anyone's interested, are two symmetrical shopping centers, the Mirowski Halls. Once the largest in Warsaw, badly damaged like all of Warsaw during the war, restored and even at one time serving as a bus depot and base for a local sports club. Now they are trading rows again. The look reminded me of the Riga market in airship hangars from that episode. But let's return to the Saxon Garden. In 1927 it opened to the public, though not to just anyone, only to the decently dressed, and thus became one of the first public parks in the world. Like much else in Warsaw, over its history the park underwent serious changes. Originally, it was a classic formal French park, but at the end of the 18th century, during Kosciuszko's uprising, it was virtually destroyed, and later restored, but now as an English landscape park. At one time, it even had baths with mineral waters, a bit like Lökerbad from that episode, greenhouses, all sorts of amusements for the public, including the inevitable skating ring. During the war, the park was closed to Poles entirely, and still suffered greatly, but was restored afterwards. If you have time and the weather permits, it's very pleasant to stroll here. Fortunately, this park, unlike Łazienki Park where we'll go later, is almost in the center. Historically, the Saxon Garden bordered the Saxon Palace on one side. It was originally built by Jan Andrzej Morsyn, the treasurer of the Polish kingdom, naturally for himself, but half a century later it was bought by Augustus the Strong and rebuilt as a royal residence. In the late 1830s to early 1840s, the palace was rebuilt in the then fashionable neoclassical style. The central part was demolished entirely and replaced with a colonnade. It was under this very colonnade that the tomb of the unknown soldier appeared. Did you know, by the way, that this is actually a French invention? One way or another, from one of Lviv's cemeteries, the remains of an unidentified Polish volunteer soldier were brought to Warsaw and reburied with honors in 1925. At the same time, an honor guard appeared here, the changing of which tourists still love to watch.
Zmiana za mną, marsz!
As you might expect, the tomb became a symbol of resistance during German occupation. People laid flowers here despite potential punishment for this, and after the war, the tomb was restored, with an ordinary bonfire serving temporarily as the eternal flame. The colonnade, blown up by the Germans, was also restored, though in a somewhat different form. And whilst clearing the rubble, it was discovered that holes have been made in the remaining columns for explosives. But the explosives themselves hadn't been placed. Why remains a mystery to this day. One post-war project proposed leaving the tomb as the Nazis had left it, so that these too would be a reminder of their crimes. But ultimately, it was decided to restore the tomb completely. Next, I suggest crossing the street that creates a certain geographical confusion. Krakowskie Przedmieście Street. Actually, this isn't rare in Warsaw at all. The part of the city on the opposite bank of the Vistula is even called Praga. Historically, this was a trade and the main ceremonial route to the royal residence, Wilanów Palace in the southeast of Warsaw. With such credentials, the street naturally quickly became lined with rich buildings, churches and palaces, such as the Tyszkiewicz-Potocki's one, which is now a Warsaw University building, the Potocki's Palace, where Napoleon danced at a ball in 1807 with his Polish mistress Maria Walewska, and the Presidential Palace, where Frédéric Chopin gave his first public concert, and in front of which memorial plaques to those who died in the Smolensk air disaster are now installed. Whilst the monument to Józef Poniatowski not only stands on the site of the monument to Ivan Paszkiewicz, which was demolished in 1917, but is also a copy donated by the Danes to replace the one destroyed by the Nazis near the Saxon Palace, where we've already been, and originally installed in Łazienki Park, where we'll go later. The Kazimierz Palace, that's the university again, Chapsky Palace, now the Academy of Fine Arts, the Church of St. Joseph of the Visitationist Order, one of the few buildings not badly damaged during the war and where Chopin used to play organ for children at services. St. Anne's Church, after which the street got its name, and the Carmelite Church, where Chopin gave his first solo organ concert. Anyway, I'll leave you to that. Stroll along the street and just look around. Of course it was restored after the war, but like much in Warsaw, they've done an absolutely remarkable job. Next, let's check another science-related feature of Warsaw: the Warsaw University Library. Outside, it's decorated with boards showing humanity's achievements in various fields. Musical notes, mathematical, chemical and physical formulae, and of course texts, since it's a library, in Sanskrit, Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, Old Russian and of course Old Polish languages. The building itself is quite recent. It opened at the end of December 1999, but because of its green color and streaks on it, it seems rather neglected. But it has an interesting secret feature that you can't see from below. Inside, the building is rather cold and concrete, not cozy at all. I love libraries, but I didn't like it here. But if you go up to the roof, and you can do this completely for free, then apart from peeking at students, have some decency, don't disturb people studying, it's still a real library after all. Apart from everything else, you'll find yourself in a botanical garden. Remember, I showed something similar in Birmingham in that episode, and also in the library, by the way. But here, there's a whole hectare and a half of various jungles, and surprisingly few people. You can also look down, of course, but I wasn't particularly impressed by the views themselves. However, as you know, I'm not much of a fan of viewing platforms. In short, don't expect panoramas, but if you're short on greenery, it seems quite worth popping up. Very close to the library, you can also pop into the Modern Science Museum. It combines several thematic permanent exhibitions, plus there are regularly new temporary ones. There are robots, there are dinosaurs, there's a huge Foucault pendulum for those who do not believe in the rotation of the Earth, and even a planetarium. Sorry, flat earthers. In short, if you have curious children or you yourself haven't quite outgrown the why stage, this is exactly the right sort of place to visit. Especially in our bonkers world of little green men from planet Nibiru and believe in the supernatural. And finally, going down, don't be lazy, just walk a little forward to the Vistula Embankment. As you probably already know, I do love being near water, so I always try to reach the local river, lake or sea. Warsaw is obviously no exception. I am not suggesting any specific place here. The embankment has been tidied up and generally looks quite well maintained. I personally was very taken by the contrast. On one side of the river is the modern embankment, with cafes, pavilions, terraces descending to the water, and on the other, a completely untouched bank. Some backwaters, meadows, as it's probably looked for centuries, perhaps since before Warsaw was even a city. You can also walk to another Warsaw Mermaid, as I promised you. She stands here on the embankment, but in my opinion, the girl on the Old Town Square is somehow more attractive. Right near the Mermaid is the entrance to Warsaw's most modern and least congested bridge. Before this bridge was built in 2000, there was another one here, the so-called Mermaid Bridge, the remains of which can still be seen nearby. From the bridge itself, on the opposite bank of the Vistula, you can make out the National Stadium, where, for example, matches of the 2012 European Championship were held. The Vistula itself, not very clear now, but I think I was just unlucky. And the embankment we've just walked along, unfortunately now rather spoiled by pointless graffiti. At this point, my path started moving away from the river. My energy also ran out and I decided to postpone the remaining part of the walk. There's still a lot of interesting stuff left though. From the story of heroic resistance by desperate but unbroken people and incredible, almost mystical post-war discoveries, to the little house where kings met their mistresses and where Poles nearly killed the emperor's brother. See you in the second part.